The door didn't just open. It exploded inward. 6 royal guards in full ceremonial armor crashed into the room of the Jae-won guest house, their torches flooding the darkness with orange fire. Behind them came the chief royal censor, a man known throughout the capital for his cold precision, his breath fogging in the pre-dawn chill. And there, on the floor beside the unconscious body of Lord Han Jae-won, one of the most powerful noblemen in the kingdom, was Seo Yeon. She was 19 years old. Her silk robes were disheveled. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins. Her eyes, when the torchlight hit them, were wide with the particular terror of someone who did not yet understand what was happening, only that it was catastrophic. "Don't move," the chief censor ordered. She didn't. She couldn't. Because Seo Yeon, the eldest daughter of the noble Seo household, the girl who had spent the last 3 months being groomed to become the future crown princess of Joseon, had just woken up in a room she did not remember entering, beside a man she had never willingly touched, with no memory of how she had gotten there. And the guards were already writing it down. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand something about Seo Yeon, because this is not a story about a helpless girl who got destroyed by circumstance. This is a story about what happens when a woman with a spine of iron gets buried alive and claws her way back to the surface. Seo Yeon was the kind of person who learned to read in secret because her stepmother told her educated women made dangerous wives. She was the kind of person who memorized every political alliance in the kingdom because she understood that knowledge was the only armor a woman in this world could carry. She was gifted, patient, and deeply, genuinely in love with Crown Prince Li Huan, the young man who had chosen her from among hundreds of candidates not because her father was powerful, but because he had spoken to her for exactly 47 minutes at an official tea ceremony and walked away unable to stop thinking about what she had said. He called her the orchid rare, fragrant, and impossible to cultivate by force. She called him nothing because she was proper, but she thought about him constantly. And now, kneeling on the floor of a guest house with a stranger's unconscious body beside her and the royal censor's brush scratching her fate into the official record, all of that, every dream, every carefully laid plan, every whispered moment of almost love, was being erased. Let me tell you how this happened. 3 nights earlier, Seo Yeon's stepmother, Lady Jae-won, had called her into the inner courtyard and handed her a cup of honey tea. "You've been working so hard," Lady Jae-won said, her face arranged in the expression of warm concern she had spent years perfecting. "Drink. You need to sleep well before the final selection ceremony." Seo Yeon drank it. She should have known. She should have seen it in the way Lady Jae-won's fingers lingered too long on the cup, in the way her stepsister Seo ran, 17, brilliant, and burning with a jealousy so hot it had long since scorched away anything resembling a conscience, watched from the doorway with an expression that was almost hungry. But Seo Yeon trusted too much. That was her one flaw. She believed that the people bound to her by family, even by an unwilling stepfamily bond, retained some basic human decency. She was wrong. The tea was laced with a sedative powerful enough to drop a horse. By the time the drug took hold, Seo Yeon remembered nothing. Not being carried, not the journey through the night streets of the capital, not being placed on the floor beside Lord Han Jae-won, who had himself been drugged by a different hand, a bribed servant who had slipped something into his evening wine. Lord Han Jae-won was 32 years old, a widower, a mid-ranking nobleman of considerable wealth and absolutely devastating political inconvenience to the Seo family's rivals. He was not a bad man. He was not a good one either. He was, at this particular moment in his life, simply a pawn, as unconscious and unaware of the trap as Seo Yeon herself. The difference was that no one would blame him in the morning. That was how it was designed. Lady Jae-won and Seo Ran had planned this for 6 weeks. Every detail. The guest house was chosen because its owner owed Lady Jae-won a debt. The bribed guards who happened to be in the area were arranged through Lady Jae-won's cousin, a minor official with gambling problems and flexible morals. The royal censor's anonymous tip about suspicious behavior at the guest house was sent 2 hours before dawn, timed perfectly to ensure discovery at maximum dramatic impact. And in the morning, while Seo Yeon knelt on that floor, shaking with cold and confusion, Seo Ran was already being fitted into her best ceremonial robes back at the family compound, preparing to present herself to the palace as the obvious replacement candidate. Now here is the thing that will make you furious. The royal censor chief magistrate O was not a cruel man. He was a thorough one. And when he looked at Seo Yeon that morning, kneeling on the cold floor, eyes clear and terrified, he felt something that might have been doubt. But doubt, in the political machinery of a royal court, is the most fragile thing in the world. It takes exactly one powerful man whispering in your ear to crush it entirely. That man was Lord Song, the Crown Prince's chief political advisor, and a man who had been quietly opposed to the Seo family's rise for years. He arrived at the guest house 20 minutes after the guards. He took one look at the scene, and he smiled, just slightly, just enough that only someone watching for it would have seen it. "This is most unfortunate," he said, to no one in particular. "The Crown Prince will be devastated." And just like that, the story was set. The narrative hardened like clay in a kiln. By the time the sun fully rose over the capital, the gossip had already traveled from the guest house to the palace kitchens to the noblewomen's quarters to the streets. Seo Yeon, the Crown Princess candidate, found compromised with a nobleman. The scandal hit the court like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples didn't stop for years. The palace convened an emergency court session that same afternoon. Seo Yeon was brought in under guard, not as a criminal precisely, but not as a free woman either. She stood in the center of the great hall with her head high and her hands trembling at her sides, and she looked up at the throne where Crown Prince Lee Hwan sat with an expression carved from something harder than marble. He was 23 years old. He was beautiful the way a drawn sword is beautiful. You could admire it fully while understanding it could cut you open. He had dark, intelligent eyes that rarely revealed what he was thinking, and in this moment, looking at Seo Yeon, they revealed absolutely nothing. She looked at him and thought, "Please believe me." He looked at her and thought, "Well, we will come back to what Lee Hwan thought." Because what he thought and what he did were two entirely different things, and the space between them would haunt everyone in this story for years. The official inquiry lasted 3 hours. Seo Yeon spoke clearly, composedly, recounting everything she could remember, which was almost nothing after she drank the tea. She described the honey tea. She named Lady Jeom. She said, in front of the entire court, in a voice that didn't waver, "I was drugged. I was placed there. I am innocent." The court murmured. Chief Censor O reported his findings. Lord Song presented his political concerns. The scandal was a threat to the dignity of the crown selection, blah blah, the usual machinery of power. And at the end of it all, the Crown Prince's father, King Taejong, rendered his judgment with the efficiency of a man who had been making uncomfortable decisions for 30 years. The candidate Seo Yeon is disqualified from the selection process. The matter of her conduct is to be referred to the Seo family for appropriate resolution. The next qualified candidate will proceed. The next qualified candidate. Seo ran, sitting demurely outside the hall in her best robes, heard those words and allowed herself exactly 1 second of savage, victorious relief before rearranging her face into appropriate concern. Seo Yeon, standing in the center of the hall, heard those words and felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, not shatter, but crack, like ice under pressure. A sound she would carry for a long time. She looked at Lee Hwan one final time before she was escorted out. He was looking at the floor. She told herself that meant nothing. She would spend the next several weeks trying to keep believing that. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. When the Crown Prince looked at the floor instead of defending Seo Yeon, was he a coward? Or was he playing a longer game? Drop your answer in the comments. Because I promise you, by the end of the story, you will have changed your mind at least once. Here is something nobody tells you about disgrace in the Joseon court. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, like paint being stripped from a wall, one thin sheet at a time, until all that's left is the bare gray stone underneath. First, they removed her name from the selection registry. Then they returned her ceremonial gifts from the palace, the silk, the jade hairpin, the embroidered screen. Each item arrived at the Seo family compound wrapped in plain cloth, without ceremony, like returning a mistake to a merchant. Then the invitations stopped coming. Then the women who had been her friends during the selection process stopped visiting. One by one, then all at once. Because association with disgrace is itself a kind of stain, And in the world Seo Yeon lived in, everyone was very careful about what they touched. And through all of this, Lady Jiam moved through the Seo compound with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had solved a very complicated problem. She was careful not to gloat. She was careful to arrange her face into appropriate maternal concern whenever she spoke to Seo Yeon's father, the scholar Seo Byung-ho, a gentle, bookish man who was genuinely devastated by his daughter's situation and genuinely oblivious to its real cause. Seo Yeon watched her stepmother perform grief and could not say a word. Not yet. She had no proof. She had her memory of the tea, her absolute certainty of her own innocence, and a burning, methodical anger that she kept banked low because she understood that anger shown too early is just weakness given a louder name. She was waiting, but the world did not wait with her. 2 weeks after the court session, a royal messenger arrived at the Seo compound with a document bearing the palace seal. It was a marriage proposal from Lord Han Jae-won, or more precisely, it was a palace-ordered marriage directive, phrased as a proposal in the way that a sword at your throat is technically a suggestion. The political logic was clean and brutal. The only way to contain the scandal was to make the two parties officially responsible for each other. If Seo Yeon and Lord Han Jae-won were married, the story became a secret romance rather than a public disgrace. Tidied everything up. For everyone except the two people being tidied. Seo Yeon read the document 3 times. Then she set it down on the table and sat very still for a long time. Her father came to her that evening, red-eyed with distress, and said, "Yeona, you do not have to." "I do," she said quietly, because there was something she hadn't told anyone yet. Something she had discovered only 4 days ago, when the court physician, sworn to confidentiality, had confirmed what her body had been telling her for 2 weeks. She was pregnant. How, you ask? How was she pregnant if she remembered nothing? If she had been unconscious? If Lord Han Jae-won himself had been drugged? This is the part of the story that is darkest and most infuriating. Seo Yeon and the physician pieced it together slowly, carefully, and what they concluded was this. Someone, the person who had arranged the setup, had ensured that the scene in the guest house was not merely one of proximity. Whoever designed this trap had been thorough. Lady Jiam had not just ruined Seo Yeon's reputation. She had ensured there would be no coming back. Seo Yeon sat with that knowledge for 3 days before she accepted the marriage directive. She accepted it not because she had no choice, though in practical terms she barely had one. She accepted it because the child growing inside her was innocent of every crime and every plan, and this child needed a name, a father, and a household. Whatever she felt about Lord Han Jae-won, a stranger, a man she had never chosen, her child had the right to more than the permanent stigma of illegitimacy. She was going to give her child everything she could, even if it cost her everything else. When she signed the acceptance, her hand was perfectly steady. Lord Han Jae-won received news of the marriage arrangement on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, he had broken 2 ink stones, sent his household steward away 3 separate times, and stood in his courtyard for an hour staring at the wall. He was a man who had been working for 5 years to rebuild his life after his first wife died of fever. He had been cautious, careful, controlled. He had started to find stability again. His estates were prospering, his reputation was recovering. His name was beginning to be associated with competence rather than grief. And now this. He had woken up in a guesthouse room with no memory and a disaster waiting for him, and the woman who had been found there with him, this Seo Yeon, this disgraced selection candidate, was apparently about to become his wife. He told his steward, in a flat voice, that he accepted the arrangement. Then he went back to staring at the wall. What Lord Han Jae-won felt in those first weeks was not hatred. It was colder than that. It was the particular fury of a man who has been robbed of his own story, who had a life planned and had it derailed by someone else's catastrophe, and who was not yet in a position to understand that he and the woman he blamed were actually victims of the same crime. He would not understand that for a long time. The wedding ceremony was small, private, almost silent. Seo Yeon wore white and pale blue, appropriate colors for the occasion, formal but deliberately understated. She had done her own hair. She had not allowed Lady Jiam near her since the night of the tea, and Lady Jiam, to her credit, seemed to understand that pushing Seo Yeon on this particular point was not worth the risk. Seo Ran attended the wedding dressed in soft pink, with the quiet proprietary air of someone watching a problem get removed from the board. She spoke to Seo Yeon once, at the reception, leaning in close to whisper, "I am sorry it had to be this way." Seo Yeon looked at her stepsister, at the familiar face she had grown up beside, the face that had smiled at her at breakfast tables and New Year celebrations and under cherry blossom trees, and felt something settle into place inside her. Not anger, not grief, just a cold, crystalline clarity. "No, you're not," Seo Yeon said, quietly, without drama, and then she walked away. Lord Han Jae-won did not speak to her on the wedding night. He arranged for separate sleeping quarters, a formal acknowledgement of their arrangement's nature, and disappeared into his study with a bottle of plum wine. Seo Yeon sat in the room they had assigned her, which smelled of cedar and unfamiliarity, and placed her hands over her stomach. "Don't worry," she whispered, to herself, to the child, to whoever was listening. "I'm going to figure this out." 3 days later, the palace decree came. By order of King Taejong, Lord Han Jae-won and his household were to relocate from the capital to his estate in Cheongcheong province. A polite way of saying they were being banished from court, removed from the center of power, sent somewhere quiet where their scandal wouldn't keep embarrassing important people. Han Jae-won read the decree at breakfast. He looked across the table at Seo Yeon, who had eaten her rice porridge without complaint and was now calmly drinking her morning tea. "We leave next week," he said. "I know," she said. That was the entirety of their conversation. Cheongcheong province in late autumn is beautiful the way abandoned things are beautiful. A little faded, a little raw, with a kind of honesty that well-maintained places never have. The Han family estate was a proper manor house, which was something. It had 12 rooms, a small garden that had been neglected for 2 years, a staff of 8 servants, and a view of the hills that, on clear days, made Seo Yeon catch her breath. She refused to be miserable about it. She absolutely refused. Han Jae-won moved through the house like a storm in a jar, contained, pressurized, and extremely careful not to interact with her more than duty required. He was coldly courteous at meals. He addressed her as Lady Han, with a formality that managed to be insulting through sheer precision. He did not ask how she was feeling. He did not ask anything about her pregnancy. He arranged for the local physician to visit her, not because he was kind, but because the child she was carrying was, under the law, his heir, and he was not a man who neglected his obligations. But obligations performed without warmth are a particular kind of loneliness. Seo Yeon had known loneliness before, the loneliness of being a well-educated woman in a house where intelligence was threatening, the loneliness of loving a crown prince from an appropriate distance. But this loneliness was different. This was the loneliness of sleeping in a room 10 paces from someone who actively resented her presence, of sharing meals with someone who had decided she was the cause of his ruined life. She dealt with it the way she dealt with everything. She kept moving. She learned the garden, learned which plants were salvageable and which were too far gone. She introduced herself to the servants with genuine interest in their names and histories, and they thawed toward her faster than their master did. She walked the town's market street twice a week, learning the merchants' faces, understanding the local economy, noting which families struggled and which thrived. She read everything she could get her hands on. She wrote letters home to her father, carefully worded to avoid alarming him. And she waited for the baby. The first snowfall of that winter came early, covering the Han estate garden in white that turned the neglected bushes into strange, beautiful shapes. Seo Yeon was in the garden, wrapped in her heaviest robe, feeding the estate's old cat, a massive gray creature named Stone who had apparently outlived 3 family heads and regarded everyone with equal suspicion, when Han Jae-won appeared in the doorway. "You shouldn't be out in the cold," he said. It was not a question. It was not warm. It was the statement of a man who had a duty of care and was discharging it grudgingly. "I'm not cold," Seo Yeon said, which was partly a lie. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Then he went back inside. But 30 minutes later, one of the servants appeared with a heavier outer robe and a cup of ginger tea. Seo Yeon held the warm cup and looked at Stone the cat, who was regarding her with his usual suspicion. "He sent these," she said to Stone. Stone blinked. "Don't read into it," she told herself. But she noticed. The baby came in the deep of winter, 2 months before Seo Yeon had fully prepared herself, which is how babies generally operate regardless of one's plans. It was a long labor, 19 hours, the midwife told her afterward, though to Seo Yeon it felt like something outside of time entirely. The manor house filled with the particular controlled chaos of birth, and outside the room where Seo Yeon labored, Jae-won paced. He paced for 8 hours. The servants, who were watching him with the carefully neutral expressions of people pretending not to observe something revealing, noted that he asked for updates every 20 minutes with increasing urgency. They noted that when the physician came out to say there were some complications, he went so still that one of the younger maids thought he had stopped breathing. When the baby's cry finally pierced the cold air of the manor house, strong, indignant, absolutely determined to be heard, Jae-won closed his eyes. The physician came out to report. Mother and child were both well. A daughter. Jae-won went in. Seo Yeon was pale and exhausted, propped against cushions, holding a small red-faced person who was already studying the ceiling with implausible seriousness. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment they were just two people standing at the edge of something they hadn't planned. "She's healthy?" he asked. "She's perfect," Seo Yeon said, and her voice, exhausted as it was, carried something absolute and inviolable. "I'm calling her Jia." He looked at the baby. Jia, apparently sensing scrutiny, turned her head and blinked at him with eyes the color of deep water. Something happened in Jae-won's face. It was subtle, a loosening around the jaw, a slight softening at the eyes, and it was gone almost instantly. He was very good at controlling his face. But Seo Yeon saw it. She filed it away because she was the kind of woman who noticed things. The weeks after Jia's birth were the first period in which Jae-won and Seo Yeon existed in something other than cold hostile proximity. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was something. Proximity generated by a third person who demanded attention regardless of adult complications. Jia had opinions, loud ones. She slept in aggressive spurts, demanded feeding at inconvenient intervals, and had developed, by 6 weeks of age, the ability to produce an expression of pure imperious disappointment that Jae-won's household steward privately described as looking exactly like the young master when someone brings him bad news. No one said this to either parent. Jae-won began appearing at breakfast, not just performing the courtesy of shared meals, actually appearing, sometimes before Seo Yeon, sitting at the table with his morning documents and the large gray cat, who had transferred his loyalty to Jia immediately upon her arrival and now stationed himself outside the nursery door with the dedication of a very old, very fluffy guard. One morning, Seo Yeon came down to breakfast to find Jae-won sitting at the table with Jia propped awkwardly against his arm. He was clearly uncertain what to do with her, his posture stiff as a man holding an unexploded object, while the baby regarded him with the patient attention of someone deciding whether a situation was worth crying about. Seo Yeon stopped in the doorway. He didn't look up. "The nurse needed to rest," he said, by way of explanation. "That was all. She likes it better if you support her head a little more," Seo Yeon said. After a moment, he adjusted his arm. Jia, apparently satisfied with this development, closed her eyes. Seo Yeon sat down across from him and poured her tea, and they ate breakfast in a silence that was, for the first time, not entirely hostile. 3 months passed, then 6. Then a year. The seasons turned over Chungcheong province, and the Han estate changed. The garden recovered under Seo Yeon's determined attention. The staff relaxed into something that resembled a functioning household, and the two people at the center of it settled into patterns. They were not a love story. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. That was what Seo Yeon told herself. She was being practical. She was building a life because her daughter needed a stable one. And because rage, however justified, is exhausting to sustain forever. But the patterns were there. Jae-won had a habit of working until well past midnight, and Seo Yeon had learned that the study lamp burning at that hour meant he had a headache but was too proud to admit it. She had stopped sending servants with tea because he sent them away. She started leaving the tea herself, on the table outside the study door, and then walking away. By morning the cup was always empty. He noticed that she checked the market prices herself rather than relying on the steward's reports, and that her eye for quality was better. He started bringing market questions to her, obliquely framed as administrative concerns, never as requests for her opinion. She answered them with equal obliqueness. They were both very skilled at not admitting they were talking. When the town experienced a harsh winter that threatened several families with food shortage, it was Seo Yeon who went to Jae-won with a detailed proposal. Their estate stores, the families most at need, a distribution system that wouldn't humiliate anyone. He read it in silence, proved it in silence, then went to implement it himself, working alongside his own servants, which surprised the townspeople considerably. When a fever swept through the estate in midsummer and took down half the household including Jae-won, it was Seo Yeon who managed everything: medicine, care rotations, maintaining the estate's essential functions, and also sitting by Jae-won's bedside at night because the servants were exhausted and someone needed to be there. He was delirious for 2 days. He said things in the fever that she never repeated to anyone. Fragments of his first wife, fragments of a grief he kept so well contained that she hadn't known the depth of it. She sat beside him and kept the fever cloths cool and did not record any of it in the ledger she kept of useful information. When he recovered, he looked at her differently. Not softly, not lovingly, but differently, as though he was recalibrating something. Okay, I have to stop here and ask you something. Because Jae-won, this man who resented her, who was cold and difficult and would rather sit in a dark study with a headache than admit he needed anything. He's been doing all these small things. Leaving tea drunk, working alongside the poor, being there quietly in ways that cost him something. Is that love? Or is it just decency? Because I think this is the question Seo Yeon was asking herself too. And I think you might already have an opinion. Tell me in the comments. At this point in the story, do you think Jae-won is falling for her? Or is he still just a man doing his duty? 2 years and 4 months after they arrived in Chungcheong province, Seo Yeon found the box. It was hidden in the garden, in the storage shed, behind a shelf of old ceramic pots, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from 2 winters. She found it by accident, clearing out the shed on a crisp autumn afternoon, while Jia toddled determinedly behind her trying to catch the cat. Inside the box were documents, old ones, dating from around the time of the palace selection process. They were correspondence between someone in the capital using a coded name, Silver Plum, and a person referred to only as the censor's cousin. The letters were careful, oblique, the way letters are when the writer knows they're creating a record of something criminal. But Seo Yeon had spent 2 years reading market reports and estate correspondence and political communiques. She knew how to read around the careful language. What she read made her hands go still. The letters described a plan, a removal of the primary candidate, payments to guards, a guest house owner, a servant in Lord Han's household. The code name Silver Plum was cautious, but Seo Yeon had grown up in the same household as Lady Jeom, and Lady Jeom had a particular fondness for silver plum blossom motifs. On her robes, her stationery, the tea bowl she used every morning. This was not proof. Not the kind that would hold up in a court. But it was the first thread. Seo Yeon wrapped the oilcloth back around the box, tucked it under her arm, carried it into the house, and locked it in the cedar chest in her room. Then she went back to catch Jia, who had finally managed to corner Stone the cat and was attempting to sit on him. Stone bore this with the dignity of a creature who had survived considerably worse. That night, Seo Yeon sat at her writing desk and began to write a very careful letter to a scholar in the capital, an old associate of her father's, a man with connections to the Historical Records Office and enough integrity not to be easily bought. She wrote and rewrote the letter 4 times. The final version contained no mention of the box, no specific allegations, just a careful series of academic-seeming questions about certain court events from 2 years ago and whether there were any official records she might consult. She sealed it at midnight and went to bed. In the dark, she lay still and thought, I have been patient. I am still patient. But patience and passivity are not the same thing. Winter came again, and with it a complication nobody had anticipated. A delegation from a neighboring province arrived at the Han estate. Merchants with a dispute over water rights that had escalated into something the local magistrate couldn't resolve. Jae-won, as the highest-ranking nobleman in the region, was expected to arbitrate. The dispute was complex. It involved 3 families, 2 rivers, a decade of competing claims, and the particular mulish stubbornness of men who had been right about something for so long they had forgotten what being right was even for. Jae-won was formidable in these situations. Methodical, absolutely unyielding when he had the facts on his side, and possessed of a patience for bureaucratic complexity that had probably been what made him good at court before the disaster. But this dispute had a legal wrinkle that touched on water law from 40 years ago, and he was not certain of his ground. He came to Seo Yeon. Not directly. He came to dinner slightly later than usual, sat down and mentioned, as a passing thought, that the water rights case involved a precedent he was having trouble locating. The tone was casual. Meant to be casual. He was still, even after 2 years, constitutionally incapable of asking her directly for help. But she was constitutionally incapable of missing a useful moment. I read something about that precedent, she said, equally casual. In the legal compendium from the palace library. I have some notes if you want to see them. He did. The notes were not notes. They were a full analysis, written in Seo Yeon's precise, clear hand, that laid out the legal precedents in order, identified the strongest arguments for each side, and suggested a resolution framework. It had clearly taken her days to compile. Jae-won read through it. Then he looked up at her. You've been thinking about this case, he said. I've been thinking about several things, she said. Another silence. But this one felt different. Less like a wall and more like a door slightly ajar. This is good work, he said finally. Which, from Jae-won, was the equivalent of most men falling to their knees in admiring amazement. I know, Seo Yeon said. Not immodestly, just truthfully. He almost smiled. She saw it, the corner of his mouth, the fractional movement. He controlled it almost immediately, but she saw it. The water rights case was resolved within a week, using her framework. The resolution was fair, solid, and held up to subsequent challenge. Word traveled, as word does in small provinces, that the Han Estate's lord had handled the case with unusual skill. What didn't travel as explicitly, but traveled nonetheless, was that the Han Estate's lady had been seen poring over legal documents, consulting with the estate steward, asking pointed questions of the visiting scholars. The town began to regard Seo Yeon with a particular kind of respectful curiosity. She was not what they had expected a disgraced capital lady to be. She was not bitter or wilted. She was not performing endless penance. She was learning their town, contributing to it, and doing it with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who was simply interested in things working correctly. They started coming to her with problems. Household disputes, medical questions, practical concerns about the upcoming planting season and the state of the road that led to the next town. She handled them all with the same methodical care. Jae-won knew about this. His steward reported it. He did not comment on it, which Seo Yeon understood to mean he didn't object. One evening, Jia was almost 2 years old by then, a decisive, clear-eyed person who had developed a habit of demanding explanations for everything and accepting none that were insufficiently detailed. Jae-won came to find Seo Yeon in the garden where she was putting the last of the autumn plants to bed. Jia was with her, theoretically helping, actually mostly redistributing the soil into patterns that pleased her. Jae-won stood at the garden gate and watched for a moment. Seo Yeon was talking to Jia, explaining what she was doing, why, the name of the plant, why it needed covering for the cold. Jia was listening with the intense focused attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting, which was most things. He watched his daughter's face. He watched Seo Yeon's hands, steady and competent in the cold soil. He said nothing. After a minute, he came into the garden and picked Jia up. She complained loudly about interruption but then immediately grabbed his collar and began telling him about the plant. And the 3 of them walked back to the house in the late afternoon light, and it looked, from a distance, exactly like a family. Spring arrived the following year, and with it, a message from the capital. Seo Yeon's letter to the scholar had borne fruit. Slowly, cautiously, in the way that information extracted from powerful institutions always moves. The scholar had found records. Not damning ones, not yet, but records that contradicted the official account of events surrounding the guesthouse incident in small, specific ways. Inconsistencies in the guard reports. A witness whose testimony had been filed but apparently never read. A purchase order for the guesthouse rental that, the scholar noted delicately, bore a signature style consistent with a particular administrative office. The kind of office that Lady Jiam's cousin worked in. Seo Yeon read the letter in her room, alone at night, with the cedar chest open in front of her and the oilcloth box inside it. She added the scholar's findings to her own. She laid it all out carefully, logically. It was still not enough for court, but it was growing. She locked the chest again and went to check on Jia, who was sleeping with the boneless total abandon of the very young. One fist pressed against her cheek and Stone the cat arranged beside her like a gray crescent moon. Seo Yeon stood in the doorway and breathed. Wait, she told herself. Be patient. Be smart. You have time. She did not know then that time was exactly what she was about to run out of. Crown Prince Li Huan arrived in Chungcheong province on a Wednesday, at the head of a royal inspection party, without warning that was functionally useful to anyone. The official notice had gone out 2 weeks earlier, as required. It had specified that His Royal Highness would be conducting a comprehensive inspection of 3 southern provinces, evaluating local governance, agricultural productivity, and the implementation of certain new tax policies. All local officials and noble households were expected to receive the party with appropriate hospitality. Han Jae-won read the notice, set it down, looked out the window for a long time, and then called his household steward to begin preparations. Seo Yeon was told about the visit by the steward, in the measured tone of someone delivering information they knew would land hard. She was standing in the kitchen supervising the preparation of Jia's lunch. When the steward finished speaking, she put down the bowl she was holding, very carefully, and said, "Thank you." Then she went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and put her hands in her lap. Li Huan, dear. She had thought about this moment, in the abstract, late at night, in the way you think about things you're not entirely sure you want to happen. She had imagined it going badly and going well and going in ways she couldn't predict, and none of the imagined versions had prepared her for the particular stillness that settled over her now. 2.5 years. In that time, her entire world had been remade. She was not the girl who had sat in a palace selection ceremony with her heart too full and her expression carefully controlled. She was someone else. Someone she actually liked better, if she was honest, even if the cost of becoming her had been everything she thought she'd wanted. And Li Huan was coming to this town, to this house, to stand in the same room as her, and she had no idea what that meant. She went to the mirror. She looked at herself. Then she went back to Jia's lunch. The Crown Prince's party arrived at the Han estate on a gray Thursday afternoon, 60 riders strong, and Li Huan himself rode at the front in dark traveling clothes that were deliberately understated. He had always been good at making himself seem approachable without actually being any less formidable. Han Jae-won met him at the gate. The meeting between the two men was courteous, formal, efficient. Li Huan had the manner of someone who had spent years managing power and had gotten very comfortable doing it. He said appropriate things about the journey, about the estate, about the province's reputation. And then he came inside, and Seo Yeon was standing in the main receiving room. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something important is happening and everyone present knows it. Li Huan stopped walking. Seo Yeon bowed, the formal bow of a lady receiving a royal guest, perfectly executed, head at exactly the correct angle. "Lady Han," the Crown Prince said. His voice was entirely steady. "Your Royal Highness," Seo Yeon said. Her voice was entirely steady. They looked at each other. There are moments between people who have history, who have lost something they both wanted, that are impossible to fully describe because they happen mostly in the spaces between words, in the microsecond adjustments of expression, in the way someone breathes. This was one of those moments, stretched out in front of the entire inspection party and Han Jae-won and 2 servants frozen in the doorway. Li Huan had dark eyes that still saw everything. He looked at her and he looked, specifically, deliberately, with the control of a man who had practiced not showing anything. He looked and something passed across his face that he did not entirely manage to suppress. She looked at him and felt something she thought she had buried make a small, involuntary movement toward the surface. Then Jia appeared in the doorway behind Seo Yeon, having escaped her nurse, as she frequently escaped her nurse, by the application of pure will, and surveyed the assembled company with the same imperious calm she brought to all situations. "Mama," Jia said. "Why are there horses outside?" The room exhaled. The inspection party stayed for 3 days. The official business was conducted efficiently. Jae-won was an effective administrator, and his records were immaculate. Lee Hwan moved through it all with the crisp professionalism of a prince who genuinely cared about governance rather than just performing it. This was one of his qualities that had always made Seo Yeon respect him. He actually paid attention. But underneath the official business, running alongside it like a current under ice, was the 3-day tension of people with complicated histories navigating a complicated present. On the first evening, there was a formal dinner. Seo Yeon sat at the table and was a perfect hostess. Attentive, composed, brilliant at the kind of polished conversation that palace selection had trained her for. Jae-won sat at the other end of the table and watched her, and watched Lee Hwan and said very little. He was not a stupid man. He had known the crown prince's connection to this story from the beginning. You cannot be banished from the capital in the wake of a palace scandal without understanding who is at the center of it. He had constructed, over 2 years, a careful understanding of what Seo Yeon's life had been before, even without her telling him directly. He watched Lee Hwan look at Seo Yeon. He had a very still face by the end of the first dinner. On the second day, Lee Hwan requested to walk the estate garden. Alone. This was unusual and everyone knew it was unusual and nobody said so, and somehow Seo Yeon ended up walking with him while the estate steward followed at a discreet distance that was discreet in name only. They walked in silence for a full minute. The autumn garden was in its late form. Spare but beautiful, the way things get when they've survived past their ornamental peak into something more honest. "You made this?" Lee Hwan asked. "Meaning the garden." "It was already here. I just kept it from dying." "That's what you do," he said. And then, quickly, "I don't mean that unkindly." "I know," she said. Another silence. Then, "Seo Yeon." She stopped walking. He rarely used her name. He had spent years being careful with her name, treating it like something fragile, as if the wrong inflection would break something between them. "Your Highness." "I knew," he said. "I want you to know that. I knew within the first week that you had been set up." The words landed in the quiet garden like stones in still water. Seo Yeon turned to face him. Her expression was very still. "How?" she asked. One word. "Controlled." "The physician's report," he said. "There were inconsistencies. The sedative used, a servant who knew too much. I had my own people look into it." A pause. "I know who planned it." "Lady Jiam," Seo Yeon said. Not a question. "And Lord Song," Lee Hwan said. "He was the one who facilitated access. He had reasons to want your family's influence diminished. Lady Jiam had reasons to want you removed. They aligned." The world felt very large and very cold around Seo Yeon. "And you knew all of this 2.5 years ago, and you let the verdict stand." It wasn't an accusation. She genuinely wanted to understand. Lee Hwan looked at her steadily. "I was not yet king. My father's court was fragile in ways that were not visible from outside. Lord Song controlled 3 of the 6 major political factions. If I had moved against him then, you would have lost," Seo Yeon said. "My father would have lost," he corrected. "The crown would have lost. There would have been a power struggle that cost the kingdom more than it cost you." The silence that followed this was the most complicated silence Seo Yeon had ever stood inside. She believed him. She had studied politics long enough to know this was exactly how these calculations worked. The throne is bigger than one person, and the people who run the throne spend their lives making exactly this kind of devastating arithmetic. She believed him. She also understood, with complete clarity, that the choice he had made, however strategically sound, had taken her life and bent it into an entirely different shape. "You let Seo Ran become crown princess," she said. "Yes. Do you love her?" A long pause. "I respect her. She is intelligent, capable, and performs her duties well." A pause. "No, I don't love her." Seo Yeon nodded slowly. "And now? Why are you telling me this now?" Lee Hwan looked at her with an expression she recognized from 2 years ago, the expression of someone who sees what they want and is calculating the cost. "Because Lord Song's position is weakening," he said. "Because my father's health is failing and I will be king soon, and when I am king, the political calculus changes. Lady Jiam and Lord Song's alliance can be prosecuted. The truth can be made official." A pause. And because I wanted you to know that I never forgot what they did to you. I never forgot you. Seo Yeon stood in the autumn garden with her hands clasped in front of her and looked at the man she had once loved, or had been very close to loving, which is perhaps the same thing or perhaps something different. She was no longer certain, and she felt the pull of it. The old story, the one that had been written before the catastrophe, tugging at her with the particular gravity of what might have been. Your Highness, she said. I have a daughter. I know. She is. She stopped, started again. She is the most important thing in my world. I know that too, he said quietly. She looked at the garden she had rebuilt from neglect, at the hills in the distance, at the space between where she was standing and the house where her daughter was, at that moment, probably staging a rebellion against her afternoon nap. Go back inside, she said gently. You have another day of inspections tomorrow. He went, but at the garden gate he stopped and said, without turning, the truth is coming out regardless of what you decide, Seo Yeon. Lady Jeom and Lord Song will be prosecuted. Your name will be cleared. That is already in motion. He walked back to the house. Seo Yeon stood in the garden alone for a long time. I have to ask you something right now, because here is a man, Lee Hwan, who knew the truth and let Seo Yeon suffer for 2.5 years because the political cost of saving her was too high. He had his reasons. He's not a villain. He made a real, painful calculation that people in power genuinely face. But is that forgivable? And more than that, is he telling her now because he loves her? Or because the political moment has finally aligned and she's convenient again? Leave your take in the comments, because I genuinely don't know the right answer. And I think that's the point. That night, after the inspection party had retired, Han Jae-won came to find Seo Yeon. She was in the study, his study, which she had started using during the hours he didn't need it because it had the best lamp and the most books. She was at his desk with a letter in front of her that she wasn't reading, just holding. He came in without knocking, which was unusual. He stood in the center of the room. What did he want? Han Jae-won asked. It was not the question he was capable of asking directly. Are you going to leave? Or do you still love him? Those required a kind of vulnerability he had spent 32 years fortifying himself against. But this question, practical and blunt, was what he had. Seo Yeon set the letter down. He told me that he knew the truth about what happened 2.5 years ago. A pause. He knew. He knew within the first week. He didn't act because the political cost was too high. Han Jae-won was very still. And now the political cost is different. Lady Jeom and Lord Song are to be prosecuted. My name will be officially cleared. The study was quiet except for the lamp. Han Jae-won stood in the middle of the room with an expression Seo Yeon had never quite seen on him before. Not the controlled blank she knew. Not the occasional unguarded softness around Jia, but something else. Something that looked, to her careful eye, like a man confronting something he had been avoiding. Is that all he told you? Han Jae-won asked. Seo Yeon looked at him steadily. He told me he hadn't forgotten me. Han Jae-won turned away. He walked to the window. Outside, the night was clear and cold, the stars hard and bright over the hills. When this is resolved, he said to the window, your situation changes. Your name is restored. His wife is... He stopped. The crown princess candidate situation is politically complex but not impossible to restructure, given sufficient motive and political will. He was doing his own calculations out loud. She recognized this, the way he processed difficult things, working them out in precise language rather than feeling. J1SSI, she said. He went still at the name. She rarely used his name. They were careful with each other's names. She got up from the desk and crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. Not touching, just beside. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I have a daughter who is nearly 3 years old and is currently trying to teach Stone the cat to walk on his hind legs. I have a garden that needs attention in the spring. I have an estate that has been running on a system I built, and if you let me, I intend to improve it further. He was looking at her now. His expression had an openness she almost never saw, something undefended. I have a box in the cedar chest, she continued. with evidence that I have spent 2 years building into something that will hold up in court, because I decided 2 years ago that I was not going to wait for someone else to clear my name. I was going to clear it myself. And I am very close. A long pause. You've been building a case, he said. For 2 years. Alone. I didn't want to involve you in something that wasn't your fight. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, it became my fight when they put you in that room. The words landed quietly, without drama, like something that had been true for a while and had simply been waiting to be said. Seo Yeon felt something shift. Not dramatically, not with a crash, but the way the light changes in a room when someone opens a curtain. Gradual. Irresistible. I need to show you the box, she said. Yes, he said. You do. They stood at the window for another moment, the cold hills outside, the warm lamp behind them, and then they went to the cedar chest together. The next morning, Lee Hwan came to find Seo Yeon before his party departed. She was in the garden because she was always in the garden, because it was where she thought most clearly, and he found her there alone in the early cold, her breath fogging in the air. He came and stood at the garden gate and looked at her. She looked back. I spoke to Jae-won this morning, Lee Hwan said. He's agreed to coordinate with my investigators regarding the case against Lady Jeom and Lord Song. He told me, Seo Yeon said. Pause. He's a good man, Lee Hwan said, and the words had a weight to them, not entirely neutral, not entirely generous, but genuine. The judgment of someone who was being honest even when honesty cost him something. Yes, Seo Yeon said. He is. Lee Hwan looked at her with the expression of a man who was very good at reading rooms and had just read this one completely. You've built something here, he said. You and he. We have. Even with how it started. People become who they are through what happens to them, Seo Yeon said. That's true for everyone. Another silence. Then, I thought I came here to offer you a way back, to what might have been. He paused. I'm not certain that's what you need. What I need, Seo Yeon said, is my name cleared and justice for what Lady Jeom and Lord Song did. That is what I need. And the rest? He asked softly. She looked at him. At this man who had been her almost, her might have been, who had made a choice that she understood even as she mourned it, and she felt the truth of her own heart with unusual clarity. The rest, she said, is already where it belongs. The crown prince bowed, the small, genuine bow of one person who respects another, not the performative bow of politics. Then he left, and Seo Yeon stood in the garden and breathed the cold autumn air and felt something that took her a moment to name. It was peace. Not the peace of giving up or giving in or accepting things that should not be accepted. The peace of a woman who has survived and built and chosen and knows the difference. The trial of Lady Jeom and Lord Song began in the capital in the early spring of the following year. Seo Yeon was not required to attend. The case was built sufficiently from her documents, the palace's own investigation, and 3 witnesses who had been waiting 2 years for someone with sufficient power to ask the right questions. Lady Jeom's cousin, when faced with the weight of a royal prosecution, abandoned his loyalties faster than ice in June. She followed the proceedings through letters, from the capital scholar, from her father, and surprisingly, from a handwritten note in Lee Hwan's own sharp script that arrived after the first week of hearings with a clean summary of the day's evidence and a single line at the bottom. The truth holds. Have courage. She read that line 3 times, then folded the note carefully and put it in the cedar chest with the other documents. Jae-won was in the capital for the first 2 weeks of the trial, required as a witness himself. He sent her reports every 3 days, thorough, precise, with the same methodical clarity he brought to his state correspondence. But sometimes, at the end of the official content, there would be something else. An observation. A description of the capital in early spring that she hadn't asked for. Small evidences of the fact that he had noticed she was not there and thought she might want to know. She wrote back, longer than she needed to, including details about Jia, who had, in the week of his absence, learned to feed the chickens and decided this was now her primary purpose in life, because she knew he would want to know, and because she liked telling him. The verdict came down on a Thursday in late spring. Lady Jeom and Lord Song were found guilty of conspiracy, bribery of royal officials, and the deliberate framing of an innocent person in a manner that affected the royal succession process. The penalties were severe: exile for both loss of titles and properties, the permanent disgrace that comes from being officially recorded as having deceived the crown. Seo Yeon, who had known of the plan and said nothing, was stripped of her selection documents, though her marriage to the crown prince, already complicated by the revelation, was addressed separately, in the political calculations of a court that had to manage the fallout of its own errors. Seo Yeon received the verdict news at the estate, on a morning when Jia had just successfully taught Stone to come when she called him, a breakthrough that the cat itself appeared to find confusing. She read the official letter. Then she put it down. Then she sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went to the courtyard where Jia was still celebrating with the cat, picked her daughter up, and held her very tightly. "Mama," Jia said patiently. "You're squishing me." "I know," Seo Yeon said, into her daughter's hair. "I know. I'm sorry. She laughed. Or cried. Possibly both. Jia, with the pragmatism of 3-year-olds, decided to accept this as normal behavior and began narrating Stone's achievements directly into her mother's ear. Jae-won came home 3 days later. He arrived in the late afternoon, as the house was settling into evening routines. Seo Yeon was in the main room helping Jia draw pictures. Jia's artistic vision was ambitious and technically experimental. When she heard the horses in the courtyard, Jia heard them too and erupted from the room with the speed of someone who had been waiting for 3 weeks without sufficient outlet for the energy this generated. By the time Seo Yeon reached the courtyard, Jia was already attached to Jae-won's leg, explaining at maximum volume everything that had happened in his absence, including but not limited to Stone's new skill, the results of a disagreement with a neighbor's dog, the progress of several plants in the garden, and the critical development of a new drawing technique she had developed independently. Jae-won was listening to all of this with an expression of focused attention that would have looked severe on most faces, but that Seo Yeon had learned to read as genuine engagement. He looked up when she came into the courtyard. She looked at him, dusty from travel, slightly tired, with Jia explaining the dog incident at high volume against his knee, and thought, there he is. Not as a dramatic revelation, more like recognition, the way you recognize your own house after a long journey, not because you've forgotten it, but because you've come back to it. "Welcome home," she said. He looked at her steadily. "How are you?" "Good," she said. "Actually good." "How was the trial?" "Over," he said. "Finished. Settled." A pause. "You're officially cleared. The official record has been amended." She nodded. She had already known this, but hearing him say it in his flat, precise voice, officially cleared, as if even now he was filing it in the correct bureaucratic category, made it real in a different way. "Thank you," she said. He looked almost startled. "For what?" "For testifying. For going. For—" She stopped, because the list was getting long and she didn't know how to end it without saying something that was not yet quite time to say. He seemed to understand. He bent down and said something brief to Jia, who accepted it with appropriate gravity and immediately redirected her narration toward her father's coat buttons. Then he straightened up and looked at Seo Yeon with an expression that had, over 2.5 years, shed every layer of its original hostility and become something entirely different. Something that had been building through cold silences and cups of tea and walks in the garden, and a cedar chest of evidence, and a fever and a water rights case, and 1,000 small moments that don't look like love until you line them all up together and see the shape they make. "I owe you an apology," he said. Jae-won SSI. "I blamed you," he said. "For 2 years I held you responsible for something that was done to both of us, and I was—" He stopped. He was not good at this. She knew he was not good at this, and she waited. "I was wrong. And I am sorry." The courtyard was quiet except for Jia, who had discovered a beetle and was introducing it to Stone with the air of someone making a formal presentation. "I know you are," Seo Yeon said, softly, not cruelly, just truthfully. "And I know it took you time. I know it wasn't simple." "Nothing about this has been simple," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's been hours." That was the truest thing she could have said. And by the way he looked at her, the slight catch in the controlled expression, she thought he understood exactly what she meant. The letter from the Crown Prince came 6 weeks later. It was formal, palace correspondence, properly sealed, properly addressed to the Lady Han of the Chungcheong Province estate. But inside the formal letter was a separate note, smaller, written in that same sharp hand she recognized. The note was brief. It said, "The matter of the Crown Princess is being addressed through official channels. I do not expect it to impact you directly. I wanted you to know, separately from anything official, that I respect the life you have built, and that if you ever have cause to bring a petition before the Crown, you will find a hearing. What might have been between us is something I will carry. But I see clearly what is. Li Huan." She read it twice. Then she folded it, went to the cedar chest, and placed it carefully inside. Not discarded. Not hidden. Preserved, because it was a genuine thing, written by someone who was more complex and more honest than she had sometimes allowed herself to remember. She respected him. She understood him. She had loved something about him once in the way that young people love the versions of the future they can see from a distance. But she was not a young woman who could only see the future from a distance anymore. She closed the chest. That evening, she and Han Jae-won sat in the study. His study, which had become somewhere between his and theirs over the course of 2.5 years, with the estate accounts open between them and Jia asleep in the room down the hall and the lamp burning low. They had been working through the accounts for an hour, which is the most practically intimate thing two people who run a household together can do, and there was a comfortable efficiency to it that had taken a long time to achieve and now felt entirely natural. Han Jae-won set down his brush and looked at her. She looked up. "I received a letter from the palace today," she said. "I know," he said. "My steward mentioned a palace seal. It was from the Crown Prince." A pause. "And," she considered how to say the next thing. Then, "He wanted me to know he respected the life I'd built, that he saw it clearly." She paused. "I think he was letting go of something, and he wanted to do it with some dignity." Han Jae-won was quiet. He was looking at the account books but not reading them. "He's a better man than I wanted him to be," he said finally, which was the most honest thing he could possibly have said. "Yes," Seo Yeon agreed. "Does it?" He stopped. He was working on asking questions directly. He had been working on it for 6 weeks. "Does it change anything for you?" Seo Yeon put down her own brush and looked at him. Really looked at him, at this man who had been her adversary and her housemate and her co-conspirator and her partner in every practical sense, and now, she thought, something more than that and different from all of those things. "Do you remember what you said in the courtyard when you came home?" she asked. "I said several things. You said nothing about this has been simple, but it's been hours." He was very still. "I said it's been hours." "You did," she said. "And that's the answer to your question." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had only seen him do a handful of times in 2.5 years. He allowed his expression to be completely unguarded. No control, no management, no calculation. Just himself. "Yana," he said, using her name as he almost never did. And the weight he gave it was different from every time Li Huan had said it. Not precious, not careful, but certain. The way you say the name of something you know as well as your own hands. "Yes," she said. "The spring planting records," he said with perfect gravity, "have an error in column 3 that I believe is actually a larger philosophical question about how we value the eastern fields relative to the western ones." She stared at him. Then she laughed, really laughed. Not the polite laugh of careful performances, but the full, involuntary laugh of someone who has been surprised into happiness. And he smiled, actually smiled, the rare full version, and they sat together in the study in the lamplight working through the accounts, and it was, in every way that mattered, exactly right. Let me tell you where everyone ended up. Lady Jiam spent her exile in a small house in the northern hills, stripped of every advantage she had built her life around. She was not unhappy. She was too practical for sustained unhappiness, but she spent the rest of her life in a diminishment she had created herself, and she knew it. Seo Ran was a more complicated ending. Stripped of her selection status, her political future drastically altered, she eventually made a different kind of marriage, to a scholar in the eastern province, a quiet man who was genuinely kind to her and expected nothing she wasn't willing to give. She was not destroyed. She was reduced and she rebuilt, and the woman she became was, in some ways, more honest than the one she had been. She and Seo Yeon never fully reconciled. But they exchanged letters, occasionally, with the careful courtesy of two people who share an origin and have stopped fighting about what it means. Lord Song was exiled to the southern coast and spent his remaining years writing political memoirs that nobody read. Scholar Seo Byung-ho, Seo Yeon's father, lived another 15 years, healthy and quietly delighted by his granddaughter, who he adored with the besotted completeness of grandparents everywhere. He visited the Chungcheong estate every spring. Stone the cat lived to an improbable age that the household physician described as medically noteworthy, and continued to tolerate Jia's experiments with patient dignity. Crown Prince Li Huan became King Li Huan, as his father's health had predicted. He was an effective king, careful, strategic, genuinely concerned with the kingdom's welfare. The matter of the crown princess was resolved through political channels. He did not remarry quickly. He governed with the kind of controlled intelligence that Seo Yeon had always recognized in him. And he governed with something else too. A fairness, she thought, that might have been partly built from the lessons of what had happened, from knowing what his choices had cost, and choosing to carry that knowledge rather than bury it. Jia grew up to be exactly what her temperament at age 3 had promised. Decisive, demanding of explanations, intensely interested in how things worked, and possessed of a humor so dry that it took people several seconds to realize they had been made to laugh. She had Han Jae-won's precision and Seo Yeon's instinct for where power actually lived. She was, by all accounts, formidable. And Han Jae-won, who had started this story as a pawn and a stranger and an adversary, who had been cold and resentful and wrong, who had spent 2 years being slowly remade by proximity to a woman who refused to be anything less than fully herself. Han Jae-won, who left tea outside study doors and sat with fevered patience at night and told the truth when the truth was inconvenient. He learned to ask directly. It took him longer than Seo Yeon's patience should have allowed, but she was patient in the ways that mattered. One spring morning, 3 years after the trial, when the garden was at its best and Jia was doing something characteristically complicated with a project in the side yard, he came to find Seo Yeon where she was pruning the late blooming tree at the garden center. He stood beside her and said, without preamble, "I would like this to be permanent." She kept pruning. "It is permanent," she said. "I mean," he paused. He was working on directness. "I want to be your husband, not in the arranged sense. In the I am choosing this. I am choosing you." She stopped pruning. She looked at him. She felt that shift again. That curtain opening. That light changing. That movement of something long building toward its settled place. J1SSI, she said. "Yes. I have been choosing you for a long time," she said. "I just wasn't sure you knew it." He was quiet. Then, "I know it now." "Good," she said, and went back to pruning, and he stood beside her in the spring garden, and Jia yelled something from the side yard that required attention, and they went to see what it was together. "Here is what I want you to take from this story. Not the scandal, not the politics, not even the love triangle, though the love triangle is the part that will keep you up at night arguing in your head. Here is what I want you to take. Seo Yeon's story is about what happens when you refuse to let what someone does to you define who you become. She was betrayed by her family, failed by a man she loved, dragged into a forced marriage with a stranger, exiled from everything she had planned. She had every reason to become bitter or broken or passive, to wait for rescue, to perform the suffering that was expected of her, to let the story other people wrote for her be the only story. She refused. She built a garden. She learned the law. She documented evidence. She talked to the servants by name and learned the town and fixed the water rights and ran the estate and raised her daughter and waited, patiently, with the particular patience of someone who is not waiting for someone else to act but is actively preparing themselves to act. She chose Han Jae-won not because she gave up on love. She chose him because she found that love can grow in unexpected soil. Quietly, stubbornly, in the space between shared work and shared difficulty and two people who stop blaming each other and start being honest. And she let Li Huan go, not because he was unworthy, but because the life she had built was real, and she was not a girl who chased might-have-beens at the cost of what was. That is a choice worth talking about. The final question, and now I have to ask you, the question that has been underneath this entire story from the moment the guards broke open that door. At the end, when Seo Yeon had both options in front of her. The crown prince who represented her past, her destiny, her first love, a powerful future beside the throne, and Han Jae-won, who represented the difficult present, the life they had built together through hardship, the father of her child, the man who had chosen her slowly and completely. She chose to stay. She chose Han Jae-won. She chose the life that had been forced on her and then made her own. She chose the love that grew in exile over the love that had bloomed in a palace. Was she right? Li Huan loved her. He let her go because he respected her choice, but he loved her. And in a different version of this story, in a world without the scandal, she would have been beside that throne. She would have been crown princess, then queen. She would have had the power to do enormous good. Did she give that up too soon? Did she let the life she built with Han Jae-won feel more real than it actually was, simply because she had lived it long enough? Or did she do the most radical thing possible? Take the life that was imposed on her, own it completely, and refuse to call it a consolation prize. I want to know what you think. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Should she have chosen the crown prince? Or did she make the right choice staying with Han Jae-won? And if you think she should have chosen neither and done something entirely her own, because honestly that might be the right answer too. This has been The Orchid and the Jade Throne. If the story moved you, if you're already arguing with yourself about what she should have done, if you found yourself choosing sides and then switching them, share this with someone who appreciates a story that doesn't have easy answers. Because the best stories never do. Until next time.